In late 1942, the United States Navy was not losing in the Pacific because it lacked ships. It was not losing because it lacked firepower. It was losing because it trusted its own rulebook more than reality. For months, American commanders did everything right. They followed doctrine. They applied approved tactics. They attacked with speed, aggression, and confidence. And they kept failing. Japanese destroyers ran supplies straight through contested waters, night after night. American cruisers were damaged. PT boats were shattered. Men died. Nothing changed. The Navy's conclusion was simple. The problem was the weapon. Small, wooden patrol boats were not meant to fight steel warships. The math didn't work. Wood against steel never does. So the failures were explained away. The losses were accepted. And the doctrine remained untouched. But war doesn't care about manuals. It only cares about outcomes. Somewhere in the Solomon Islands, a junior officer began to notice something uncomfortable. Not a new weapon, not a classified technology, just a pattern everyone else had dismissed. The enemy wasn't unbeatable. They weren't faster. They weren't smarter. They were predictable. And more dangerously, they were looking in the wrong direction. The U.S. Navy believed speed meant survival. The Japanese believed movement meant threat. Both assumptions were logical. Both were wrong in the same way. What followed was not a heroic charge, not a perfectly executed battle, and not a clean victory. It was an act that violated training, contradicted doctrine, and forced the Navy to confront an uncomfortable truth: that the most dangerous weapon in war is not the enemy's firepower, but your own certainty. This is not a story about bravery. It is not a story about luck. And it is not a story about a single ship being sunk. It is the story of how one incorrect assumption nearly cost a campaign, and how breaking the rules, quietly and imperfectly, changed the balance of an entire war. I want to understand how wars are really decided, not by firepower, but by flawed assumptions. Stay with this story. By the end of 1942, the Pacific War had exposed a quiet contradiction inside the United States Navy. On paper, everything made sense. In reality, almost nothing worked. American naval doctrine had been built around a simple hierarchy of force. Large ships defeated small ones. Steel dominated wood. Firepower determined outcomes. Speed ensured survival. This logic was not careless. It was the product of decades of professional naval education, war games, and theoretical refinement. It was taught, tested, and reinforced at every level of command. And it had worked before. But Guadalcanal was not behaving like the war the manuals described. Night after night, Japanese destroyers slipped through contested waters, delivering supplies, evacuating wounded troops, and reinforcing positions that were supposed to be isolated. American forces knew these convoys were coming. They knew the routes. They knew the timing. And yet, they failed to stop them. Each failure was explained with technical reasoning. The enemy had superior night fighting experience. Their crews were better trained for darkness. Their coordination was tighter. Their commanders more aggressive. These explanations were comforting because they preserved the integrity of the system. If the problem was enemy excellence, then the doctrine itself remained sound. But there was another explanation, far more dangerous to acknowledge: that the doctrine was being applied to a situation it was never designed for. Patrol torpedo boats were not built to fight destroyers. They were conceived as opportunistic predators, fast, light, expendable craft, meant to harass transport ships and retreat before retaliation. Their strengths were surprise and speed. Their weakness was everything else. The Navy knew this, which is why the official doctrine emphasized constant motion. Engines at full throttle, rapid approach, immediate withdrawal. Speed was life. Stopping meant death. In training exercises, this logic held. In theory, a moving target was harder to hit. In theory, speed compensated for fragility. But Guadalcanal introduced variables no classroom had modeled properly: darkness thick enough to erase distance, narrow channels that constrained movement, predictable sea lanes forced by geography, and an enemy that did not scan for shapes, but for motion. The more aggressively PT boats followed doctrine, the more visible they became. Roaring engines announced their presence long before they entered torpedo range. White wakes cut through black water like flares. Searchlights found them with ease. Each engagement followed the same pattern: detection, illumination, gunfire, retreat. Torpedoes were fired under pressure, at long distances, against alerted targets. Misses were blamed on faulty equipment. Losses were blamed on inherent vulnerability. The conclusion, increasingly shared among senior officers, was brutal but logical. PT boats were ineffective against destroyers. Some went further. They called the missions reckless, unnecessary, suicidal. And so the narrative hardened. The failures were not systemic. They were inevitable. This is how institutions protect themselves, by redefining repeated failure as proof of impossibility. But war does not care whether an idea feels reasonable. It cares whether it works. While reports stacked up and casualties mounted, the core assumption remained untouched. That speed was the only form of protection. That stopping was equivalent to surrender. No one questioned whether the enemy was actually threatened by speed. No one asked what the Japanese were truly watching for in the darkness. The system did not lack intelligence. It lacked curiosity. And in that gap between certainty and observation, the Pacific Campaign bled time, ships, and men. Guadalcanal became a place where doctrine met friction, where textbook logic collided with physical reality, where doing everything right produced the wrong result. The Navy was not failing because it lacked courage, or resources, or discipline. It was failing because it mistook consistency for correctness. And that mistake would continue until someone inside the system noticed the one thing the manuals never taught them to see. The United States Navy believed it was fighting destroyers. In reality, it was fighting a system. What American commanders called the Tokyo Express was not a tactic in the traditional sense. It was a logistical rhythm, a nightly pulse that kept Japanese forces alive on Guadalcanal despite overwhelming daylight superiority by American aircraft. By day, the seas belonged to the United States. By night, they belonged to whoever understood darkness better. Japanese destroyers did not move randomly. They ran on schedules shaped by geography, fuel constraints, tide patterns, and human endurance. They entered narrow waters at predictable hours, hugged coastlines to minimize exposure, unloaded quickly, and vanished before sunrise. From the American perspective, this should have been exploitable. Predictability is weakness, at least in theory, but theory assumes the observer understands what to look for. American planning focused on interception, find the convoy, engage it, destroy it. The problem was not a lack of information. Aircraft spotted the destroyers regularly. Intelligence reports mapped their routes. Commanders knew when and where the runs would happen, yet the Express kept moving. Because the Japanese were not relying on surprise alone. They relied on expectation. They expected American ships to behave according to doctrine, to charge, to maneuver aggressively, to reveal themselves through movement. And they were right. Destroyer crews were trained to scan for speed and wake patterns. They did not search for stillness near shore. They did not expect threats to wait. Their mental model of danger was dynamic. Motion meant attack. Silence meant absence. This mattered more than tonnage or armor. The Tokyo Express succeeded because it turned the environment itself into a shield. Darkness compressed perception. Shorelines cluttered vision. Narrow channels forced predictability, but only for those watching the wrong things. The American Navy, meanwhile, treated each failed interception as a discrete event. A bad night, poor visibility, equipment malfunction, crew inexperience. No one stepped back to examine the pattern as a whole, and patterns are where systems reveal themselves. Every night run reinforced Japanese confidence. Every successful delivery extended the campaign. Every delay in stopping the Express translated into more fighting, more casualties, more pressure on American ground forces. Guadalcanal was not bleeding because of one failed engagement. It was bleeding because of accumulated nights. This is how wars are lost quietly, not through catastrophe, but through persistence. The irony was painful. The United States possessed overwhelming industrial capacity, superior firepower, numerical advantage. But the Express did not challenge strength. It exploited habit. American doctrine assumed that aggression disrupted logistics, but aggression without adaptation only confirmed enemy expectations. The Japanese did not need perfect execution. They only needed Americans to keep doing what they had always done. And they did. Speed remained the solution to every problem. If an attack failed, it was because it wasn't fast enough. If losses occurred, it was because the boats weren't moving quickly enough. So commanders demanded more aggression, more thrust, more risk. The environment did not change. The outcome did not change. The Tokyo Express was not winning because it was invisible. It was winning because it was familiar. And familiarity is lethal when it blinds observation. What the U.S. Navy faced was not a superior enemy, but a mirror. A reflection of its own assumptions moving back and forth through the same waters, night after night. The system rewarded repetition. The doctrine punished deviation, which meant that even if someone noticed the pattern, the system itself discouraged acting on it. Innovation required uncertainty. Uncertainty required admitting that the manual might be incomplete. And institutions built on certainty do not admit incompleteness easily. As the weeks passed, Guadalcanal became less a battle and more an endurance test. Not of firepower, but of imagination. The Tokyo Express did not need to win decisively. It only needed to continue. And it would have if the war had remained a contest of doctrine versus doctrine. Systems do not collapse when they are attacked head-on. They collapse when someone understands how they actually function. That understanding would not come from the top. It rarely does. It would come from the margins, from someone close enough to observe, but distant enough from tradition to question what everyone else accepted as obvious. Institutions are designed to remove randomness. They standardize behavior, enforce procedure, and minimize deviation. This is how they scale competence across thousands of people. But war introduces a paradox. The more rigid the system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to the one variable it cannot fully control: human perception. In late 1942, the U.S. Navy had no shortage of trained officers. What it lacked was someone willing to trust observation over instruction. That person did not come from the Naval Academy. He did not arrive carrying the prestige of tradition or the authority of seniority. He arrived with something far more dangerous: a lack of reverence for how things were supposed to be done. Reserve officers occupied an uncomfortable space in the wartime Navy. They were trained quickly, assigned to experimental platforms, and expected to execute missions that career officers often avoided. They were not shaped by years of doctrinal reinforcement. They were shaped by exposure. Where academy-trained officers saw failures as statistical inevitabilities, reserve officers saw repetition. And repetition invites questions. Night after night, the same outcomes unfolded. High-speed approaches, early detection, heavy fire, withdrawal. What mattered was not the courage of the crews. Everyone involved was brave. What mattered was that the result never changed. From the inside, this was easy to rationalize. From the margins, it was impossible to ignore. The variable was not technology. It was attention. Someone began paying attention not to the enemy's ships, but to their behavior. Not to what they carried, but to what they expected. Not to how they fought, but to what they ignored. The Japanese destroyers were disciplined, efficient, professional. They were also human. Their crews scanned the water for signs of threat using the same assumptions American crews did. Movement indicated danger. Sound indicated presence. Speed meant attack. Stillness meant nothing. This was not arrogance. It was efficiency. No navy trains its gunners to watch empty darkness near shore. No doctrine emphasizes what cannot be measured or easily categorized. And that was the blind spot. The insight did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as discomfort. Why did every engagement begin the same way? Why did detection always come before contact? Why did the enemy always seem prepared, no matter how aggressive the approach? These were not questions doctrine encouraged. Doctrine encouraged execution, not inquiry. Within the system, questioning outcomes was acceptable. Questioning assumptions was not. That distinction matters, because once someone begins to question assumptions, the system has only two responses: correction or resistance. The correction never came. Standard operating procedures remained unchanged. After-action reports reinforced existing explanations. Failures were absorbed without adaptation. From the system's perspective, this made sense. Changing doctrine based on anecdotal success was dangerous. Lives depended on predictability, but predictability was already costing lives. The officer who noticed the pattern did not frame his observation as a challenge to authority. He framed it as a problem to be solved. If speed revealed presence, what happened without speed? If noise attracted attention, what happened without noise? If the enemy watched open water, what happened near the shoreline? These questions were not radical. They were simply outside the curriculum, and that made them threatening. To senior officers, deviation looked like recklessness. Cutting engines near enemy warships violated every principle of survivability. A stationary boat could not maneuver. A stationary boat could not escape. From a doctrinal standpoint, the idea bordered on insanity. From an observational standpoint, it addressed the only thing that mattered: detection. This was the moment where systems and individuals collide, where lived experience confronts institutional memory, where rules written for general safety meet conditions they were never meant to address. The system did what systems always do when challenged from below. It hesitated, not because it was malicious, but because it was cautious. Lives were at stake. One failure could validate every warning the manuals contained. Continued failure was already validating nothing. The debate was never about courage. It was about trust. Trust in the manual versus trust in the man. Trust in accumulated knowledge versus trust in immediate observation. The Navy had to decide whether doctrine existed to protect people from reality, or to help them survive it. That decision would not be made in classrooms or conference rooms. It would be made at sea, under conditions where hesitation carried its own cost. And it would hinge on whether the system was willing to accept one uncomfortable truth: that sometimes the most dangerous thing an institution can do is assume it already understands the problem. Military doctrine is built on averages. It assumes typical behavior, typical conditions, and typical reactions. That is its strength and its weakness. What the manuals taught about PT boats was not wrong in general. Speed was protection in open water. Movement did reduce exposure under most conditions. Noise did matter. The problem was that Guadalcanal was not a typical environment. It was constrained, dark, predictable, and predictability changes perception. The key insight did not come from courage or brilliance. It came from reframing the problem. The U.S. Navy believed it was being detected because its boats were too small, too fragile, too exposed. But detection was not based on size or vulnerability. It was based on expectation. Japanese destroyer crews were not searching the sea indiscriminately. They were filtering information, discarding what did not match their mental model of threat. They expected attacks to come fast, loud, and from open water. That expectation shaped everything they paid attention to. This is how human perception works under stress. We do not see everything. We see what we are prepared to see. Movement was not just visible, it was meaningful. It confirmed danger. Stillness did not. The manuals treated speed as a shield. In practice, speed became a signal. Engines announced presence. Wakes revealed direction. Acceleration invited attention. The insight was simple, but uncomfortable. What if protection came not from motion, but from its absence? This was not a new idea in warfare. Ambush had existed for as long as humans fought. What made it controversial was the platform. PT boats were never meant to wait. They were meant to strike and flee. Waiting required patience. Patience required restraint. Restraint contradicted training. Cutting engines near enemy warships violated every instinct drilled into crews. Without power, there was no maneuverability, no immediate escape. From the outside, it looked like surrender. But the insight reframed risk. Risk was not being stationary. Risk was being detected. The enemy's search pattern mattered more than their firepower. Japanese destroyers were optimized for night combat against other warships. They used optics, searchlights, and radar to find moving targets in open water. Their crews were trained to respond quickly once a threat was confirmed. But confirmation depended on cues: noise, wake, speed. Near shore, darkness was thicker. Background clutter was higher. Distances were harder to judge. A motionless boat blended into the environment. It did not announce itself as a problem to be solved. This was not invisibility. It was irrelevance. The manuals had no category for irrelevance. They described how to survive once noticed. They did not ask how to avoid notice entirely. That distinction mattered more than any weapon. The insight also exposed a deeper issue. Doctrine assumed the enemy reacted logically to all threats equally. In reality, enemies prioritize. The Japanese were not careless. They were focused. Their attention was directed outward, toward open water. They were protecting against the most obvious danger, which meant they were blind to the least obvious one. Understanding this required abandoning the idea that warfare was symmetrical, that both sides saw the battlefield the same way. They did not. One side saw movement as safety. The other saw movement, what demanded response. Both sides believed they were being rational. Both sides were reinforcing the same mistake. The insight challenged more than a tactic. It challenged the belief that doctrine could anticipate every condition. It suggested that manuals did not fail because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. And incompleteness is dangerous in institutions that value certainty. Accepting the insight meant accepting uncertainty. It meant admitting that years of training had overlooked something basic. That admission carried risk beyond the battlefield. If this assumption was wrong, what else was? The resistance was not emotional. It was structural. Large organizations are slow to pivot because pivots break continuity. They introduce ambiguity where predictability once existed, but Guadalcanal was already ambiguous. The only certainty was failure. The insight did not promise victory. It promised possibility. Possibility that detection could be delayed. Possibility that torpedoes could be fired before alarms sounded. Possibility that engagement could begin on different terms. This was not a guarantee. It was a gamble. And war is built on gambles. The difference is whether those gambles are conscious. The manual offered safety through repetition. The insight offered risk through deviation. What followed would determine whether the Navy remained trapped by its assumptions or whether it was willing to test the idea that silence could be more powerful than speed. Ideas do not fail first on the battlefield. They fail first in meeting rooms. Before a tactic can be tested in war, it must survive something far more unforgiving: institutional fear. The insight was clear enough to those who had observed the pattern, but clarity does not equal acceptance. For the U.S. Navy, in late 1942, the problem was not whether the idea might work. The problem was what it would mean if it did. Doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It creates shared expectations so that thousands of people can act as one. Breaking doctrine does not just change tactics, it fractures trust. If a junior officer could ignore established procedures and succeed, what did that say about the procedures themselves? This was the unspoken danger. The proposed approach violated multiple layers of training. Cutting engines removed maneuverability. Waiting invited surprise. Operating close to shore limited escape routes. From a safety perspective, it was indefensible. Commanders were not blind to the failures of existing tactics. They had read the reports. They knew the casualty numbers. But abandoning doctrine based on observation rather than proof felt reckless. War punished recklessness brutally. The Navy had already lost boats and men. Another disaster would not just cost lives, it would confirm every warning the manuals contained. So resistance took a familiar form. Caution was framed as responsibility. Skepticism was framed as professionalism. Adherence to doctrine was framed as care for the crews. No one said, "We refuse to adapt. His no have that can." They said, "We cannot gamble with lives." And they were right partially. But they were also trapped by a false choice. Between rigid safety and reckless innovation, the reality was more complex. Continuing failed tactics was not safe. It was merely familiar. Each night the Tokyo Express ran unchallenged. The cost accumulated quietly. More supplies reached Japanese forces. More American ground troops remained under pressure. More time passed. Time is the currency of war. And the Navy was spending it without results. The turning point did not come from persuasion. It came from exhaustion. After repeated failures, the question shifted. Not, is this idea dangerous? Yes. But is the current approach any safer? 2.7. Free hand. This is how institutions change, not through conviction, but through attrition. Permission was not granted enthusiastically. It was granted reluctantly. One attempt. limited scope, no guarantees. The system did not embrace the idea. It tolerated it. This distinction matters. Tolerance means that success will be questioned, failure will be blamed. The burden of proof shifts entirely onto the deviation. If it works, it was luck. If it fails, it was proof the manuals were right. This is the asymmetry innovators face inside rigid systems. The officer proposing the tactic understood this. He did not promise victory. He promised a chance to engage on different terms. That was all the system was willing to allow. What followed was not a dramatic declaration or a sweeping doctrinal change. There were no speeches, no applause, just a quiet acceptance that something different would be tried once. The environment remained unchanged. The darkness was still absolute. The channels still narrow. The enemy still disciplined. What changed was posture. Instead of charging forward, the boats positioned themselves. Instead of announcing presence, they waited. Instead of relying on speed to survive, they relied on expectation to fail. The risk was real. A stationary boat, once detected, had little chance to escape. There was no margin for error. This was not bravery. It was calculation. The calculation was simple. Detection determined survival. Survival determined opportunity. The gamble was not about firepower. It was about timing. If the idea failed, it would not fail quietly. It would fail catastrophically. This knowledge weighed on every decision, every order, every moment of waiting. The system watched closely, not with hope, but with suspicion. Because if this worked, it would force uncomfortable questions about training, about assumptions, about who was allowed to innovate and who was not. And if it failed, the system would close ranks, reaffirm doctrine, and move on. That is how institutions protect themselves. What happened next would determine more than the fate of a single mission. It would decide whether the Navy was capable of learning under pressure, or whether certainty would continue to outweigh observation. Deviation from doctrine carries a price. Sometimes, that price is paid by the person who takes the risk. More often, it is paid by someone else. When the Navy allowed the new approach to be tested, it did so under the illusion of control. One attempt, limited scope, contained risk. War does not respect containment. The moment the rules were bent, the environment reacted. Not dramatically, not immediately, but differently. The system had assumed that success and safety were linked, that the correct tactic would naturally minimize loss. Reality proved less generous. Innovation did not eliminate danger. It redistributed it. Silence delayed detection. Waiting bought time. But once contact occurred, there was no margin for recovery. A stationary boat that was discovered became the most vulnerable thing on the water. This is the paradox of adaptation in war. The very conditions that create opportunity also magnify consequence. The Navy learned quickly that success did not come cleanly. It came unevenly. Some crews executed the new approach with discipline and restraint. Others, emboldened by the possibility of surprise, pushed too far. They mistook deviation for immunity. The system had warned about this. And in this, it was not wrong. Not every boat that tried to adapt survived. Losses still occurred. Men still died. And each casualty reopened the debate that doctrine had tried to settle. Was this proof that the new idea was flawed? Or proof that war punished inconsistency? Institutions struggle with this distinction. They want clear causality, clear rules, clear accountability. But innovation produces ambiguous outcomes. It succeeds unevenly. It rewards judgment more than obedience. That makes it uncomfortable. Within the Navy, the reaction fractured along familiar lines. Some officers focused on what had been achieved. Others focused on what had been lost. Both were right. The question was not whether the cost existed. The question was whether the cost was lower than before. This is how war forces moral arithmetic. Not between right and wrong, but between worse and less worse. The new approach did not promise safety. It promised relevance, and relevance mattered, because for the first time, the Tokyo Express was not moving unchallenged. For the first time, Japanese commanders had to account for uncertainty. That uncertainty altered behavior. Convoys slowed. Routes shifted. Timing changed. Each adjustment reduced efficiency. Each hesitation disrupted rhythm. The Express no longer flowed freely. It stumbled. This effect did not appear in after-action reports as a dramatic victory. There was no single moment of collapse. Instead, there was friction. Friction is how systems fail. Japanese destroyer crews became cautious. Caution costs time. Time costs logistics. Fear does not need to destroy ships to be effective. It only needs to interfere. From the American perspective, this was difficult to measure. There were still losses, still failed engagements, but the strategic pressure had shifted. The Navy faced an uncomfortable realization. The value of the new tactic was not in its kill count. It was in its disruption. This challenged another assumption embedded in doctrine, that effectiveness could be measured purely in tonnage and destruction. In reality, effectiveness often appears first as hesitation on the enemy's side. But that realization came at a human cost. Men who took part in these operations understood the stakes intimately. They knew that deviation offered no protection if something went wrong. They knew that failure would not be attributed to circumstance, but to choice. This knowledge weighed heavily. Innovation is often described as boldness. In practice, it feels like isolation. The individuals involved did not feel like pioneers. They felt exposed. And the system did not rush to reassure them, because systems rarely celebrate those who operate at the edge of acceptability. They tolerate them only as long as results justify discomfort. This is the bargain war makes with those who adapt. You may change the outcome, but you will carry the uncertainty alone. As the campaign continued, the Navy faced a final reckoning. It could retreat into doctrine and accept continued attrition. Could refine what it had learned, acknowledging both its potential and its cost. The decision would not erase loss. Nothing could. But it would determine whether those losses produced understanding, or simply became numbers in a report. Guadalcanal had already taken enough lives to prove one thing beyond doubt. War does not reward purity of method. It rewards those who learn fastest, and are willing to accept the weight of that learning. Wars rarely turn on singular moments. They turn when behavior changes. After the first disruptions, the Tokyo Express did not collapse. It adapted, and adaptation revealed what had truly been at stake all along. Japanese commanders did not need confirmation of total defeat to reconsider their approach. They only needed uncertainty. For months, the Express had operated on confidence, predictable routes, reliable timing, minimal interference. That confidence was now compromised. The change was subtle at first. Convoys delayed departures. Destroyers increased spacing. Commanders altered coastal approaches. None of this appeared dramatic on a map. But each adjustment carried a cost. Logistics depend on rhythm. Break the rhythm, and efficiency erodes. Supplies arrived later. Evacuations became riskier. Coordination suffered. Fear introduced friction, and friction accumulated. This was the effect doctrine had failed to anticipate. The American Navy had been measuring success through destruction. Ships sunk, tonnage lost, casualties inflicted, but the real impact unfolded elsewhere. It unfolded in hesitation. Japanese commanders could no longer assume uncontested passage at night. They had to plan for the possibility of unseen threats, and planning for uncertainty consumes attention. Attention diverted from execution reduces effectiveness. This was not a tactical victory. It was a psychological one. The Express continued to run, but it ran wounded. And wounded systems bleed quietly. From the American side, the shift was not immediately celebrated. There were still losses, still imperfect outcomes, but something had changed in the balance of initiative. For the first time, the Navy was not merely reacting, it was shaping enemy behavior. This distinction matters more than it appears. Reaction cedes control. Shaping behavior asserts it. The PT boats did not dominate the sea. They influenced decisions. And influence is the currency of strategy. Inside the Navy, this forced a reassessment. Not of bravery, not of equipment, but of how success was defined. The old metric decisive engagement had failed to capture reality. What mattered now was disruption. Doctrine does not adapt easily to abstract metrics. It prefers clarity. But war often operates in gradients. The Navy began to recognize that success could look like delay, like diversion, like doubt. This recognition did not come with fanfare. It came with quiet adjustments. Training evolved. Expectations shifted. Assumptions softened. The manuals did not declare themselves wrong. They expanded. This is how institutions survive. They absorb contradiction gradually. The change also exposed another uncomfortable truth. Innovation had not come from superior intelligence or better resources. It had come from proximity. Those closest to the problem had seen it first. This challenged the hierarchy of expertise the Navy relied on. It suggested that observation mattered as much as education. Not everyone welcomed this implication, but war has a way of enforcing lessons regardless of comfort. As the Guadalcanal campaign progressed, the cumulative effect became undeniable. Japanese reinforcements dwindled. Operational tempo slowed. Eventually, evacuation replaced resupply. The Express no longer sustained the campaign. It merely prolonged it, and prolongation was no longer enough. When the Japanese withdrew from Guadalcanal, it was not because they had been annihilated at sea. It was because sustaining the position had become untenable. This outcome did not hinge on one officer or one idea. It hinged on a shift in understanding. That doctrine is not a map. It is a starting point. The Navy did not abandon structure. It refined it, and in doing so, it preserved something more important than certainty. It preserved adaptability. This adaptability would echo beyond Guadalcanal, into future campaigns, into future doctrines, not as a named tactic or celebrated innovation, but as a cautionary memory, a reminder that systems fail when they confuse repetition with correctness, and that enemies do not need to be overpowered, they need to be disrupted. The Pacific War would continue, with greater battles, greater losses, but something essential had shifted. The Navy had learned that winning was not always about striking harder. Sometimes, it was about being seen less, and that lesson, learned quietly in dark waters, would shape how it fought long after the Tokyo Express had faded into history. Interested in the stories where strategy breaks before armies do, subscribe for more documentaries about the hidden mechanics of war. These are the lessons history rarely teaches but always repeats.